Deconstruction of America begins with and depends on the deconstruction of American men. The left want to define traditional masculinity as toxic. They want to define the traditional masculine virtues, things like courage and independence and assertiveness, as a danger to society.
Republican Senator Josh Hawley back in 2021 discussing what he calls the decline in masculinity. Though the Missouri lawmaker has been one of the loudest voices speaking out against these so-called attacks on manhood, his rhetoric has become all too familiar with young men in the country. This is an issue we've discussed on the show before. And for more, we're joined by writer for the Washington Post's opinion section, Christine Emba, and author, entrepreneur, and professor at New York University's Stern Business School, Scott Galloway. Good to have you both. And Christine, you dive into the conversation about American masculinity in a new essay entitled Men Are Lost. Here's a map out of the wilderness. And let me read from a part of it because it's really compelling and it's a hard conversation to have. You say, I started noticing it a few years ago. Men, especially young men, were getting weird. For all their problems, the strict gender roles of the past did give boys a script of how to be a man. But if trying to smash the patriarchy has left a vacuum in our ideal of masculinity, it also gives us a chance at a fresh start, an opportunity to take what is useful from models of the past and repurpose it for boys and men today. We can find ways to work with the distinctive traits and powerful stories that already exist. Risk-taking, strength, self-mastery, protecting, providing, procreating. We can recognize how real and important they are, and we can attempt to make them pro-social, to help not just men, but also women, and to support the common good. In my ideal, the mainstream could embrace a model that acknowledges male particularity and difference, but doesn't denigrate women to do so. It's a vision of gender that's not androgynous, but still equal, and relies on character, not just biology. And it acknowledges that certain themes, protector, provider, even procreator, still resonate with many men and should be worked with, not against. But how to implement it? Frankly, it will be slow. A new masculinity will be a norm shift, and that takes time. The women's movement succeeded in changing structures and aspirations, but the social transformation didn't take place overnight, and empathy will be required, as grating as that might feel. So what are the challenges moving forward, Christine, to actually make these changes? Do we have to confront what is happening right now?
Yes, absolutely. And first of all, thank you so much for having me to talk about this. I do feel that it's a really important issue, even though I'm obviously not a man myself. I think one of the challenges that we've been facing in bringing this issue to the fore is that, you know, we do have the statistics, right? We see that for every 100 women who graduate from college right now, only 74% of men do, or only 74 men do for every 100 women. Men make up 3 out of 4 deaths of despair. So we know that there is something going on. The problem that I outline in this piece specifically is that progressives and the left especially seem to not want to acknowledge this, or at least not acknowledge that men might be a group in need of assistance itself. There's a sort of hesitance to talking about men as men. And instead people want to say, well, we just need to be good people. But what does that look like specifically? Because young men especially are asking for a specific path.
And Scott, I'm curious what you think of Christine's piece and how it perhaps reflects in what you're seeing in the younger generations.
Good to be with you. I think Christine's piece was a tour de force, an important work, and we're finally having a more productive conversation where we're acknowledging that compassion is not a zero-sum game, that we can acknowledge that young men are 3 times as likely to be addicted, 4 times as likely to kill themselves, 12 times more likely to be incarcerated and recognize it's not a zero-sum game, that civil rights didn't hurt white people, that gay marriage didn't hurt heteronormative marriage, and acknowledging the statistics and then speaking about this problem in societal terms as we speak about problems and very real issues facing women and non-whites, that we're finally having a productive conversation. And also asking an important question: should a 19-year-old boy who has an education system bias against him on a behavior-adjusted basis, boys are twice as likely to be suspended, 5 times as likely if you're a black boy than a girl, should that 19-year-old pay for the sins and the advantages of his father and his grandfather? These young men are struggling. And because of the good work of Christine and a more productive dialogue, we're finally having a productive conversation around solutions instead of a gag reflex around the issue, because unfortunately, some very negative voices have filled this void where there was no discussion.
Totally agree.
Well, and that's what's remarkable, Christine, about your piece. I was reading the piece, and I would get certain parts. I go, wait a second, she's saying this out loud because this is what everybody's talked about, but they haven't said certain parts out loud.
That's right.
But one thing that you talk about that I think any parents or people that have known younger women have seen for some time, and it started with, I think, our family about 10, 11 years ago. We would have friends of the family who, young women, and it would be like a Friday night, and there was somebody that they were dating, and would say, "Oh, you're going out, with so and so." No, he's playing video games. No, he's doing this. No, he's getting it. And we weren't prodding, but we've all had these conversations, and it started about 10 years ago, where I would like say to me, guys, go, wait, a lot of these kids, a lot of these guys in their 20s and early 30s are playing video games and watching porn and staying inside of their house and living with their parents and are not moving forward. But we really didn't know what was going on. We know now, and it is not good. And that's what I loved about your article. It was like, don't run away from masculinity. Don't pretend it's not there. But as you said, and as Scott said all along, use those strengths, use those traits in a way that helps all of society. And as Scott says, the key to it is that it's used to protect others.
Right. I think that's exactly right. This was a question that I started asking myself when I was writing my book, Rethinking Sex, which came out last year. I talked to a lot of young women, and they also mentioned that the men who they were hoping to date were just not there. Exactly as you said, they were, at home playing video games and watching porn, or just not stepping up. And then talking to guys themselves, they almost seemed confused as to what they were supposed to do. Like, are we allowed to talk to women? Are we not supposed to talk to women? I'm so confused. I guess I'm just not going to do anything at all. And they're looking for a path forward. But unfortunately, progressives and the left are not really offering a path. So instead, they turn to often right-wing figures. Josh Hawley is one of the tamer of the bunch, I would say. But even people like Andrew Tate, who has become famous recently after being retweeted by Elon Musk and, more importantly, being imprisoned in Romania for sex trafficking. Those are the examples they go to, these awful models of masculinity, because there aren't better pro-social models of masculinity that they can look towards. And that seems like a real lack in our society. And it's only going to get worse as, a vast swath of young men begin to feel more and more lost and disappear.
Scott, I have both a teenage daughter and a teenage son, and I have different concerns about each of them. Obviously, the challenges for a young woman with social media and so many other things coming up in this world. But also, when I think about my young son, and I'm curious what you think about this, he will hear out there things like toxic masculinity in boys and all these things that have sort of been injected into the bloodstream. And there is a generation, it's just true, it may not be a welcome thought for some people watching. It's just true that there are young boys now who are hearing from the time they are, sentient, basically, that they are inherently, there's something wrong with them, or there's something bad. They need to temper themselves and tame themselves a little bit. What is the impact of terms like toxic masculinity?
It's shame and it's rage, and to not acknowledge that we're having an important conversation about the continuum of sexuality, and we need to acknowledge that everyone along that continuum deserves a certain amount of dignity and respect and equal rights, but also to embrace those among us who are binary, to embrace masculinity. Masculinity is a wonderful thing. And essentially on the far left, we've decided that masculinity is being more feminine, and yet the majority of women will say that they want men to initiate romantic interests. 75% of women still consider economic viability a key consideration in selecting a mate. It's only 25% for women. So while the world wants the positive aspects of masculinity, young people are told that masculinity is a negative. Masculinity is a wonderful thing. And just to move to solutions, you're talking about your boy. The point in a boy's life where he comes off the rails and starts becoming one of these poor citizens, quite frankly, more likely to engage in misogynistic content, less likely to believe in climate change, starts blaming women for his problem or his parents, that point is when they lose a male role model. So I think moving to solutions and helping to redefine masculinity, which we get to do, it's a societal construct. The ultimate expression of masculinity, including from some of the men around this table, is to take an interest in the life of a young boy that isn't yours. That is when boys start to fail, is when they don't have a male role model. And even to acknowledge that young boys need older men in their lives evokes a negative reaction. It's a wonderful thing to be involved in a young boy's life. And we've been told that anything around special advocacy for young boys is somehow toxic. This is hugely important that we begin a productive conversation. When we talk about issues facing people of color, we talk about, or women, we talk about societal problems. We talk about the need for social problems. When we talk about young men, we use words like level up and accountability. We can absolutely do something about this. We need to embrace a modern form of capitalism. We need to lean into it. And we need to acknowledge that no cohort in America has fallen further faster than young men.